sold for her father's gambling debt. The cattle baron paid the price and won her heart. The devil's bargain. The amber glow of kerosene lamps cast dancing shadows across the weathered walls of Murphy's Saloon in Dusty Creek, Texas, 1887. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the bitter scent of whiskey, while the steady rhythm of poker chips created a hypnotic soundtrack to broken dreams and shattered hopes. Sarah Mae Whitmore pressed herself against the rough wooden wall outside, her calico dress trembling with each labored breath. The fabric, once a cheerful blue with tiny white flowers, had faded to the color of old bruises, much like everything else in her life these past 2 years. Through the grimy window, she watched her father's weathered hands shake as he pushed forward the last of his meager coins, each one representing another meal they wouldn't have, another night they'd go to bed with empty bellies. "I ain't got nothing left, Baron." Thomas Whitmore's voice cracked like dried leather left too long in the sun. His once proud shoulders had curved inward, as if the weight of his failures was physically crushing him. "But I got something worth more than gold." The man across from him, known only as the cattle baron, sat motionless, his broad shoulders filling the chair like a mountain of resolve. His dark eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his black Stetson, studied Thomas with the patience of a predator who knew his prey was already trapped. James Mackenzie had built his reputation on reading men's souls as easily as he read the weather, and what he saw in Thomas Whitmore was a man drowning in his own desperation. The saloon's other patrons had grown quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. Even the piano player had stopped his tinkling melody, leaving only the sound of labored breathing and the occasional clink of glass against wood. Murphy himself stood behind the bar, polishing the same glass over and over, his eyes fixed on the drama unfolding at the corner table. "Your daughter ain't collateral, Whitmore," the Baron's voice rumbled low, each word measured like bullets in a chamber. He'd seen too many men try to trade their children's futures for temporary relief from their mistakes. It was a line he'd never crossed, despite the harsh realities of frontier life. "She's 18, strong as an ox and prettier than a Sunday sunrise," Thomas pleaded, desperation coating every syllable like honey on a bitter pill. "Worth every penny of what I owe and more. She can cook, clean, tend animals. Hell, she's got more sense in her little finger than I got in my whole body." Sarah Mae's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The debt was $300, more money than their failing farm had seen in 2 years of drought and failed crops. Her father's gambling had started small, a few coins here and there to ease the pain of watching their land wither under the relentless Texas sun. But like a prairie fire, it had consumed everything in its path, their savings, their livestock, their hope, and now apparently her future. She remembered when her father had been different, before her mother died of fever 3 years ago, before the drought killed their crops, before the bank started sending threatening letters. Thomas Whitmore had been a proud man then, a farmer who worked from dawn to dusk and still found time to read her stories from her mother's worn Bible. Now he was a hollow shell, gambling away what little remained of their lives in a desperate attempt to reclaim what was already lost. The Baron's fingers drummed once against the table, a sound that seemed to echo through Sarah Mae's very soul. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he weighed her father's words against his own moral compass. James Mackenzie was known throughout the county as a fair man, but also as one who didn't suffer fools gladly. He'd built his ranch from nothing, carved it out of the harsh Texas landscape through sheer determination and an iron will. $300, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of finality, "for her freedom and your debt. But understand this, Whitmore. If I take her, she becomes my responsibility, not your burden to reclaim when fortune smiles on you again." The words hit Sarah Mae like a physical blow. Freedom? Was that what this was? Or was it simply a prettier word for slavery? She'd heard stories of women sold to pay debts, of lives destroyed by desperate fathers and cruel masters, But there was something in the Baron's tone, something that suggested this transaction was different from the others she'd heard whispered about in town. Thomas nodded eagerly, relief flooding his features like water breaking through a dam. "She'll be better off with you than starving on my land. You got my word on that, Baron. She's a good girl, never gave me a lick of trouble, knows her place and keeps her mouth shut when she should." The Baron's eyes flicked toward the window, and for a moment Sarah May thought he might have seen her, but he turned back to Thomas without acknowledgement, his expression unreadable. "I'll collect her at dawn," he said, rising from his chair. His imposing frame cast a long shadow across the saloon floor, and Sarah May noticed how the other patrons instinctively gave him space. "Have her ready." As the handshake sealed her fate, Sarah May felt the ground shift beneath her feet like quicksand. The life she'd known, tending their small garden, reading her mother's worn Bible by candlelight, dreaming of a love that would find her naturally, crumbled like autumn leaves in a harsh wind. She was no longer Sarah May Whitmore, daughter of a failed farmer. She was now property bought and paid for like a horse or a head of cattle. She slipped away from the window and ran through the dusty streets of Dusty Creek, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. The town was small, barely more than a wide spot in the road with a general store, a church, a blacksmith, and Murphy's saloon. Most of the buildings were weathered wood that had turned gray under the relentless sun, and tumbleweeds collected in the corners where the wind deposited them. The Whitmore farm sat 2 miles outside of town, a collection of ramshackle buildings that had seen better days. The house was little more than a cabin, with a sagging roof and windows that no longer held glass. The barn leaned at a precarious angle, and the fields that had once grown corn and wheat were now nothing but cracked earth and stubborn weeds. Sarah May sat on the front porch, staring out at the desolate landscape that had been her world for 18 years. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light that made the abandoned fields look like a vast cemetery. She thought about her mother, buried in the small plot behind the house, and wondered what Elizabeth Whitmore would think of her husband's final betrayal. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered to the night air. "I tried to take care of him like you asked, but I wasn't strong enough." The hours passed slowly, each one bringing dawn closer. Sarah May packed her few belongings in her mother's old carpet bag, 2 dresses, a worn chemise, her mother's Bible, and a small wooden cross her father had carved for her 10th birthday, back when his hands were steady and his heart was still whole. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, she heard her father's unsteady footsteps on the porch. He'd finally come home from the saloon, probably after drinking away what little money he had left. "Sarah May," he called softly, his voice thick with whiskey and shame. "We need to talk." She didn't answer, couldn't trust herself to speak without screaming. Instead, she continued folding her few possessions, each movement deliberate and controlled. "I know you're angry," Thomas continued, settling heavily into the chair beside her. "But you gotta understand this is the only way. The Baron, he's a good man, rich, respected. You'll have a better life with him than anything I could give you." "A better life as what?" Sarah May finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "His servant? His whore?" Thomas flinched as if she'd struck him. "Don't talk like that. He paid your price, which makes you his responsibility. But James Mackenzie ain't the kind of man who'd hurt a woman. I made sure of that before I agreed." "You made sure?" Sarah May turned to face him, and he recoiled from the fury in her eyes. "You made sure of nothing, Papa. You sold me like a piece of livestock and told yourself it was for my own good. I had no choice." Thomas's voice cracked with emotion. "The bank's gonna foreclose next week. We got no money, no food, no future. At least this way, you'll survive." "And what about you?" Sarah May asked. "What happens to you when I'm gone?" Thomas looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I reckon I'll figure something out." They both knew he wouldn't. Without her to take care of him, Thomas Whitmore would drink himself to death within a year. But Sarah May was beyond caring about his fate. He'd made his choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the morning air, and Sarah May's heart began to race. Her new life was about to begin, whether she was ready for it or not. Chapter 2: The Ride to Redemption. Dawn broke over the Texas plains like spilled honey, painting the endless sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to stretch from one edge of the world to the other. The vastness of it all made Sarah May feel small and insignificant, a tiny figure in a landscape that dwarfed human concerns and ambitions. She stood on the sagging porch of her childhood home, a small carpet bag containing her few possessions clutched in her trembling hands. The morning air was crisp with the promise of another scorching day, and she could smell the dust and sage that characterized this harsh but beautiful land. The thunder of hoofbeats announced the Baron's arrival before she saw him. He rode a magnificent black stallion that moved with the fluid grace of shadow and lightning, its rider sitting tall in the saddle with an authority that seemed to command the very wind. The horse was clearly a thoroughbred, its coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning light, and Sarah May found herself wondering what it would be like to ride such a magnificent creature. "Miss Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat as he dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Up close she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, marks of a man who'd spent countless hours squinting into the sun and wind. His face was carved from granite, all sharp angles and strong lines, but there was something in his gaze that wasn't entirely hard. His clothes were well made but practical: dark trousers, a white shirt, a leather vest, and boots that had seen plenty of use but were well maintained. "I reckon you know why I'm here," he continued, his voice gentler than it had been in the saloon. There was a slight drawl to his words, the accent of a man who'd been born and raised in Texas but had traveled enough to smooth out the rougher edges. Sarah May lifted her chin, summoning courage she didn't know she possessed. She'd spent the night thinking about this moment, preparing herself for whatever was to come. "I know what my father done, but I want you to know, I ain't no man's property, debt or no debt." A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, and she caught a glimpse of the man beneath the stern exterior. "No, miss, you surely ain't." He gestured toward a chestnut mare standing beside his stallion, her coat the color of autumn leaves and her eyes gentle and intelligent. "That's Buttercup. She's gentle as morning rain and twice as reliable. She'll be yours for as long as you're at the ranch." The gesture surprised her more than anything else could have. She'd expected chains, not kindness. She'd prepared herself for cruelty, not consideration. The mare was beautiful, clearly well cared for, and the fact that he'd brought her a horse of her own suggested that he saw her as more than just cargo to be transported. I don't know how to ride," Sarah May admitted, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Then I'll teach you," James replied simply. "Can't live on a ranch without knowing how to sit a horse." He helped her mount Buttercup, his hands steady and respectful as he adjusted the stirrups to fit her shorter legs. The mare stood perfectly still during the process, as if she understood that her new rider was nervous and inexperienced. "Just relax," James instructed as he swung up onto his stallion. "Buttercup knows what she's doing. Trust her, and she'll take care of you." As they rode across the rolling plains, Sarah May found herself gradually relaxing into the rhythm of the horse's gait. The morning sun warmed her face, and the endless expanse of grassland stretched out before them like a green ocean. She'd never been more than a few miles from Dusty Creek, and the sheer scale of the landscape was both terrifying and exhilarating. James, who had finally introduced himself properly as James Mackenzie, spoke little during the ride, but his silence wasn't cruel or dismissive. It was the comfortable quiet of a man who understood that words were precious things, not to be wasted on empty chatter. When he did speak, it was to point out landmarks or to offer gentle corrections to her riding posture. "That's Eagle Rock," he said, indicating a massive stone formation that jutted up from the plains like a sleeping giant. "You can see it from anywhere on the ranch. Good landmark to remember if you ever get turned around." "How big is your ranch?" Sarah May asked, genuinely curious despite her circumstances. "About 50,000 acres," James replied matter-of-factly. "Takes most of a day to ride from one end to the other." The number was incomprehensible to Sarah May, whose entire world had been contained within the boundaries of her father's 40-acre farm. That's enormous. Big enough to get lost in, small enough to call home, James said with a slight smile. "Got about 2,000 head of cattle, dozen good horses, and a house that's seen better days but keeps the rain out." As they rode, Sarah May found herself stealing glances at her unlikely savior. His hands on the reins were steady and sure, calloused from years of hard work but gentle with the horse. There was no cruelty in his bearing, no sense of ownership over her person. Instead, she sensed something deeper, a loneliness that matched her own, a sadness that he carried like a weight on his shoulders. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with oak trees and crossed by clear streams. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, their lowing carried on the wind like a natural symphony. It was beautiful country, harsh but magnificent, and Sarah May found herself understanding why someone would fight to claim it. "Why'd you really pay my father's debt?" she asked, as they paused to water the horses at a clear stream that bubbled over smooth stones. The water was cold and sweet, and she drank deeply, realizing how thirsty the morning ride had made her. James was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He stood beside his stallion, one hand resting on the horse's neck, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Finally he spoke, his voice so soft she had to strain to hear it. "Because I know what it's like to be sold by someone who should have protected you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sarah May wanted to ask more, to understand what he meant, but something in his expression warned her that the subject was closed. Instead, she filed the information away, another piece of the puzzle that was James Mackenzie. They remounted and continued their journey, the sun climbing higher in the sky as the morning progressed. Sarah May was beginning to feel more confident on Buttercup, and she found herself enjoying the sensation of movement, the feeling of covering ground at a pace faster than her own 2 feet could manage. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, wanting to break the silence that had settled between them. "What will I be expected to do?" James considered the question carefully. "That depends on what you're good at and what you want to learn. Maria, she's the housekeeper. She could use help with the cooking and cleaning. But if you're interested, I could teach you about the cattle, the horses. Ranch work ain't easy, but it's honest work and there's satisfaction in it." "I'd like that," Sarah May said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "I'd like to learn." "Good," James replied, and she caught another glimpse of that almost smile. A person should know how to take care of themselves, no matter what life throws at them. As they crested a hill, Sarah May got her first glimpse of the Mackenzie ranch, and her breath caught in her throat. The main house was larger than anything she'd ever seen, built from local stone and weathered timber, standing 2 stories tall with a wraparound porch that offered shade from the relentless sun. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the property, and she could see cattle grazing in pastures that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and meant it. "It's home," James replied simply, but she could hear the pride in his voice. "And now I reckon it's yours too." The words sent a strange thrill through her. Home. She'd never had a real home, not since her mother died. The farm had been a place of struggle and disappointment, but this looked like a place where a person could build a life. As they rode down the hill toward the ranch buildings, Sarah May felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, being sold to pay her father's debt would turn out to be the best thing that had ever happened to her. Chapter 3. Learning to Breathe. The Mackenzie Ranch sprawled across the Texas landscape like a kingdom carved from earth and sky, more magnificent than anything Sarah May had ever imagined. The main house, built from local stone and weathered timber, stood 2 stories tall with a wraparound porch that offered shade from the relentless sun. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the property like satellites around a central star, each one serving a specific purpose in the complex operation of running a cattle ranch. "Maria!" James called as they approached the house, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "We got company." A woman emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. Maria Gonzalez had been the ranch's housekeeper for 15 years, and it showed in the way she moved with confident familiarity through the space. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, with warm brown eyes, graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and a maternal smile that made her the heart of the ranch operation. Her dress was simple but clean, and she wore a colorful shawl that spoke of her Mexican heritage. "Dios mío," she murmured, taking in Sarah May's travel-worn appearance with a practiced eye. "You look like you could use a good meal and a soft bed, mija." "Sarah May, this is Maria," James said, dismounting and helping Sarah May down from Buttercup. "She runs this place better than I do. Maria, Miss Whitmore will be staying with us. I trust you'll help her get settled." Maria's knowing look passed between them, and Sarah May wondered what the older woman was thinking. But Maria simply nodded, her expression warm and welcoming. "Come, mija, let's get you cleaned up and fed. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." The observation was more accurate than Sarah May cared to admit. The last few months had been lean ones, with her father spending what little money they had on gambling rather than food. She'd grown thin, her dresses hanging loose on her frame, and she was constantly tired from the strain of trying to keep their failing farm running. The room Maria showed her to was on the second floor, simple but clean and comfortable. A window overlooked the eastern pastures, offering a view of rolling hills dotted with cattle. A quilt in shades of blue and white covered the bed, and a small wooden cross hung on the wall, touches that spoke of care and attention to detail. "This was Senor James's wife's sewing room," Maria explained quietly as she helped Sarah May unpack her few belongings. "But it has been empty for 5 years now. I think she would be happy to know it is being used again." "His wife?" Sarah May asked, hanging her spare dress in the small wardrobe. "See Elena. She died in childbirth, along with the baby, a son." Maria's voice was soft with old grief. "Senor James, he has been alone since then, working himself like a man trying to outrun his ghosts. He is a good man, but he carries much pain." The information explained the sadness Sarah May had sensed in James, the loneliness that seemed to surround him like a cloak. She found herself wondering what Elena had been like. What kind of woman could capture the heart of a man like James Mackenzie? "The bathroom is down the hall," Maria continued, pulling Sarah May from her thoughts. "There's hot water for a bath, and I'll bring you some of Elena's old clothes. You're about the same size, I think." The luxury of a hot bath was almost overwhelming after months of cold water and hurried washing. Sarah May sank into the copper tub with a sigh of pure pleasure, letting the warm water soothe muscles that had been tense for longer than she could remember. The soap smelled of lavender, and there were soft towels that felt like heaven against her skin. The clothes Maria brought were beautiful, far nicer than anything Sarah May had ever owned. A riding skirt in dark blue wool, a white cotton blouse, and a leather vest that had been tailored to fit a woman's form. There were also boots, sturdy but well-made, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun. "Elena, she was from a wealthy family in San Antonio," Maria explained as she helped Sarah May dress. "But she loved the ranch life, loved working with the horses and cattle. These clothes, they are made for a woman who works, not just for show." That evening, Sarah May joined James and the ranch hands for dinner in the large kitchen. The long table was made from rough-hewn oak, scarred from years of use but polished to a warm glow. The kitchen itself was spacious and well-equipped, with a large stove, multiple work surfaces, and shelves lined with preserves and supplies. The ranch hands were a diverse group, some Mexican, some Anglo, some with the weathered look of men who'd spent their entire lives outdoors. They ranged in age from barely 18 to well past 60, but they all shared the easy camaraderie of men who worked together and trusted each other with their lives. "Miss Sarah May," called out Cookie, the ranch cook whose real name was lost to time and whose age was a matter of speculation. He was a grizzled man with a gray beard and twinkling eyes, and his cooking was legendary throughout the county. "You ever worked cattle before?" "No, sir," she replied honestly, feeling suddenly self-conscious among these experienced ranch hands. "But I'm willing to learn." "Well, you come see me tomorrow morning," James said, his voice carrying across the table with quiet authority. "Time you learned what this place is about." The conversation flowed around the table, the men discussing the day's work, cattle to be moved, fences to be mended, horses to be broken. Sarah May listened with growing fascination, beginning to understand the complexity of running a ranch this size. It wasn't just about cattle. It was about weather patterns, grass conditions, water sources, market prices, and 100 other factors that had to be balanced and managed. "We got a new bull coming in next week," said Tom Rodriguez, the ranch foreman. "Paid good money for him, so we better make sure he earns his keep." "What about that section of fence by Willow Creek?" asked another hand. "Storm damage from last month still ain't been fixed." "I'll take a crew out there tomorrow," James replied. "Can't afford to lose cattle to broken fences." Sarah May found herself impressed by the way James managed the conversation, listening to each man's concerns and making decisions with quiet confidence. He clearly respected his workers, and they respected him in return. It was a far cry from the desperate, chaotic atmosphere she'd grown up with. After dinner, James walked her out to the porch, where they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the vast expanse of the ranch. The sky was painted in brilliant oranges and purples, and the air was filled with the sounds of evening, cattle lowing in the distance, horses nickering in the corrals, the soft murmur of the ranch hands settling in for the night. "It's peaceful," Sarah May said, breaking the silence. "Most of the time," James agreed, "but it's also hard work, dangerous sometimes. Ranch life ain't for everyone." "What made you choose it?" she asked, genuinely curious. James was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri," he said finally. "My father was a hard man, quick with his fists and slow with his praise. When I was 16, he sold me to a neighbor to pay off a gambling debt. Worked for that man for 2 years before I saved enough to buy my freedom." Sarah May's breath caught. So that was what he'd meant earlier about knowing what it was like to be sold. "What did you do then?" "Came to Texas, worked for other ranchers, learned the business, saved every penny I could. When I had enough, I bought this land and started building." He gestured toward the ranch buildings, the corrals, the vast pastures. "Took me 15 years to build all this. Every fence post, every building, every head of cattle represents something I earned with my own hands." "And your wife, Elena?" James's expression softened. "Met her at a dance in San Antonio. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant, could have married anyone she wanted. But she chose me, chose this life. We had 5 good years together before—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "I'm sorry," Sarah May said softly. "Life's hard," James replied simply, "but it's also beautiful, if you know how to look for the beauty. Elena taught me that." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Sarah May found herself thinking about her own life, about the journey that had brought her here. For the first time in years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. The next morning, Sarah May found herself in the corral with James and Buttercup, beginning her education in ranch work. The morning air was crisp and clean, and she could smell the scent of hay and horses, leather and dust, the distinctive perfume of ranch life. "First thing you need to understand," James said, adjusting the stirrups on Buttercup's saddle, "is that the horse is your partner, not your servant. You work together, you trust each other, and you take care of each other." He taught her the basics of horsemanship, how to sit properly in the saddle, how to hold the reins, how to communicate with the horse through subtle shifts in weight and pressure. Buttercup was patient with her inexperience, responding to James's voice commands when Sarah May's signals were unclear. "Cattle are like people," he explained as they rode out to check on a small herd grazing near the house. "They got their own personalities, their own fears and comforts. You respect that, and they'll respect you back. Try to force them, and they'll fight you every step of the way." Sarah May watched in fascination as James demonstrated how to read the cattle's behavior, how to anticipate their movements, how to position himself and his horse to guide the herd without causing panic. It was like a dance, she realized, a complex choreography between human, horse, and cattle that required skill, patience, and understanding. "Now you try," James said, positioning Sarah May and Buttercup at the edge of the herd. Her first attempts were clumsy and ineffective. The cattle ignored her, or worse, moved in the opposite direction from where she wanted them to go. But James was patient, offering quiet guidance and encouragement, never criticizing her mistakes or making her feel foolish. "Don't try so hard," he advised during one particularly frustrating moment. "Let Buttercup do the work. She knows what she's doing." Gradually, Sarah May began to understand. It wasn't about forcing the cattle to obey. It was about working with their natural instincts, guiding them gently in the direction you wanted them to go. When she finally managed to move a small group of cattle from one part of the pasture to another, she felt a surge of accomplishment unlike anything she'd ever experienced. "You're a natural," James said, as they returned to the barn that evening, both dusty and tired but satisfied with the day's work. "I never thought I'd like it," Sarah May admitted, brushing down Buttercup with careful strokes. The mare had worked hard all day and she deserved proper care. "But there's something about being out there working with the animals. It makes me feel alive." James paused in his own grooming, studying her with those dark eyes. Freedom has a way of doing that to a person. Over the following weeks, Sarah May threw herself into learning everything she could about ranch life. Maria taught her to cook for a large group of hungry men, to preserve food for the winter, to mend clothes and linens. The ranch hands showed her how to repair fences, how to identify different breeds of cattle, how to spot signs of illness or injury in the animals. But it was James who became her primary teacher, patiently showing her the intricacies of ranch management. She learned about breeding programs, about rotating pastures to prevent overgrazing, about the economics of cattle ranching. She discovered that she had a natural aptitude for the work, an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that impressed even the experienced hands. "You got a gift," Tom Rodriguez told her one day as they worked together to separate a sick calf from the herd. "Most people take years to learn what you picked up in weeks." Sarah May found herself changing both physically and mentally. The constant outdoor work had strengthened her body, and the good food had filled out her thin frame. But more importantly, she was discovering a confidence she'd never known she possessed. For the first time in her life, she was doing work that mattered, work that she was good at. Her relationship with James was evolving as well. The initial awkwardness of their unusual arrangement had given way to a comfortable partnership. They worked well together, anticipating each other's needs and movements with an ease that surprised them both. Their conversations during long rides revealed shared values and dreams, and Sarah May found herself looking forward to their time together. "You ever think about the future?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Every day," James replied, "but I've learned not to plan too far ahead. Life has a way of changing your plans whether you want it to or not." "What would you change if you could?" Sarah May pressed. James was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I'd bring back the people I've lost," he said finally. "But since I can't do that, I'd try to make the most of what I have." Sarah May understood. She'd lost her mother, and in a way she'd lost her father too, to gambling, to despair, to his own weakness. But here, on this ranch, she was building something new, not just a life, but a sense of purpose and belonging she'd never experienced before. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah May began to feel truly at home on the ranch. She had her own responsibilities now, her own role in the daily operations. The other hands treated her with respect, and Maria had become like a mother to her. Most importantly, she was discovering who she really was beneath the fear and desperation that had defined her for so long. But even as she settled into her new life, Sarah May couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too good to last. Happiness in her experience was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the harsh realities of the world. She tried to push the feeling aside, to focus on the present moment, but deep down, she knew that her past would eventually catch up with her. She had no idea how right she was. Chapter 4. When the Past Comes Calling. 3 months had passed since Sarah May's arrival at the ranch, and the transformation was remarkable. The thin, frightened girl who had arrived with nothing but a carpet bag and a heart full of fear had blossomed into a confident young woman who could rope a steer, break a horse, and manage a herd of cattle with the skill of someone born to ranch life. Her hands had grown calloused from rope and reins, her skin bronzed by the Texas sun. More importantly, she'd discovered a strength within herself she'd never known existed. The constant physical work had built muscle and endurance, but it was the mental and emotional growth that truly marked her transformation. The relationship between her and James had evolved into something deeper than employer and employee, though neither had spoken of it directly. Their conversations during long rides had revealed shared dreams and quiet fears, creating a bond that went beyond the circumstances of their meeting. She'd learned about his childhood in Missouri, his service in the Confederate Army during the war, the pain of losing his wife and unborn child. He'd listened to her stories of growing up with an increasingly desperate father, her love of reading, her dreams of seeing the ocean someday. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The question had been weighing on her mind for weeks, born from a growing awareness that her feelings for James were becoming something more than gratitude or friendship. "Every day," James replied honestly, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "But then I remember that running away never solved anything. Sometimes you got to stand and fight for what matters." His words proved prophetic. The next morning, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced unwelcome visitors. Sarah May was in the garden behind the house, tending to the vegetables that would help feed the ranch through the winter, when she heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. 3 men rode hard toward the ranch, their horses lathered with sweat, and their faces grim with purpose. Even from a distance, Sarah May could sense the menace in their approach, the way they rode with the aggressive confidence of men who were used to taking what they wanted. Sarah May recognized the leader immediately, Silas Crane, the man who'd held her father's debts before James paid them. Crane was a thin, sharp-featured man with cold gray eyes, and a reputation for collecting what he was owed by any means necessary. He dressed like a gentleman in a black suit and string tie, but there was nothing genteel about his methods. The other 2 men were clearly hired muscle, hard-faced men with the look of those who'd do anything for money. One was a giant of a man with scarred knuckles and a broken nose, while the other was smaller but carried himself with the coiled tension of a rattlesnake ready to strike. "Mackenzie!" Crane called out as he reined in his horse near the main house, his voice carrying across the yard with arrogant authority. "We need to talk." James emerged from the barn, his hand resting casually on the grip of his Colt .45. The gesture appeared relaxed, but Sarah May had learned to read his body language, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes assessed the threat these men represented. "Crane," James said, his voice deadly calm, "what brings you to my land?" "That debt you paid for Whitmore," Crane said, dismounting with theatrical flourish. "Turns out the old fool had other obligations, debts that predate what he owed at Murphy's. By law, that girl belongs to me now." Sarah May felt ice form in her veins despite the warm morning sun. She'd been helping Maria hang laundry, but now she stood frozen, a wet sheet clutched in her hands like a shield. The nightmare she'd thought was behind her was returning with a vengeance. The debt was paid in full, James said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who wasn't used to being challenged. I got the papers to prove it. Not all of it, Crane sneered, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. Whitmore borrowed money from me 6 months before he started gambling at Murphy's. $500 to save his farm. When he couldn't pay, I let it ride, thinking he'd come good. But now I'm calling it in, with interest. Sarah May's mind raced. She remembered her father mentioning a loan, but she'd thought it had been repaid long ago. The possibility that there might be other debts, other claims on her freedom, had never occurred to her. Even if that's true, James said, taking a step forward, his presence seeming to fill the space between them. The girl ain't responsible for her father's debts. She's under my protection now. Crane's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass, sharp and unpleasant. Protection? You bought yourself a whore, Mackenzie. Nothing more. And now I'm here to collect what's rightfully mine. The words hit Sarah May like a physical blow, but they seemed to ignite something dangerous in James. His entire demeanor changed. The careful control he always maintained slipping away like water through a sieve. She'd never seen him truly angry before, and the transformation was both terrifying and magnificent. You got 3 seconds to get off my land, James said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Before I forget I'm a civilized man. I got legal papers, Crane insisted, but his bravado was beginning to crack under the weight of James's cold fury. Sheriff's backing me on this. Then bring the sheriff, James replied, his hand moving closer to his gun. But until then you're trespassing. And in Texas, a man's got a right to protect his property and his people. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Sarah May could see the ranch hands emerging from various buildings, their hands near their weapons. Cookie appeared on the porch with a shotgun, while Maria crossed herself and whispered a prayer in Spanish. The tension was broken by the sound of more horses approaching. Sarah May's heart sank as she saw Sheriff Tom Bradley riding toward them, accompanied by 2 deputies. The sheriff was a fair man, weathered by years of keeping peace in a hard land, but he was also a man who followed the law, even when it led to unpleasant consequences. What's the trouble here? Sheriff Bradley asked as he dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene with practiced assessment. No trouble, Sheriff, Crane said smoothly, his demeanor changing instantly to that of a wronged citizen seeking justice. Just trying to collect what's legally mine. He handed the sheriff the document he'd been waving, and Sarah May watched with growing dread as Bradley examined it carefully. The sheriff's expression grew increasingly grim as he read, and she knew that whatever was written there was going to change everything. This appears to be legitimate, the sheriff said finally, his voice heavy with reluctance. Debt contract signed by Thomas Whitmore, dated 6 months before the gambling debt Mr. Mackenzie paid. It could be forged, James said, but even he seemed to realize how weak the argument sounded. Could be, the sheriff agreed, but it looks real enough to me, and until a judge says otherwise, I got to enforce it. Sarah May felt her newfound world crumbling around her. The life she'd built here, the sense of belonging she'd discovered, suddenly felt as fragile as morning frost. She was about to become property again, this time to a man who clearly had no intention of treating her with the respect and kindness James had shown. Please, she said, stepping forward, her voice barely above a whisper. There has to be another way. Crane's cold eyes fixed on her, and she saw something in them that made her skin crawl. Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll take real good care of you. The implication in his words was clear, and Sarah May saw James's hand tighten on his gun. For a moment, she thought he might actually draw on Crane. Consequences be damned. But then his eyes met hers, and she saw the anguish there, the knowledge that violence would only make things worse. I need time to verify these documents, James said finally, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining control. Surely you can give me that much. Time for what? Crane demanded. To hide her? To spirit her away in the night? I don't think so, Mackenzie. She comes with me now, or I'll have the sheriff arrest you for interfering with the law. Sheriff Bradley looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, but he nodded reluctantly. I'm sorry, James, but if the papers are legitimate, I got no choice. Sarah May felt the walls closing in around her. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd become, was about to be stripped away by a piece of paper, and the greed of a man who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. But then she remembered something, a conversation she'd had with her father weeks before his final gambling binge, when he'd been going through her mother's things. He'd mentioned finding some old papers, documents that her mother had kept in a small wooden box. At the time, Sarah May had been too grief-stricken to pay much attention, but now she wondered if those papers might contain something that could help her. Wait, she said, her voice stronger now. I need to go back to my father's farm. There might be something there that could help resolve this. Like what? Crane demanded suspiciously. Papers, Sarah May said, thinking quickly. My mother kept all the family documents in a box. If my father borrowed money from you, there might be a record of it being repaid. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance she had. Crane looked skeptical, but Sheriff Bradley nodded thoughtfully. That's reasonable, the sheriff said. If there are documents that could shed light on this situation, we should examine them. Fine, Crane said after a moment's consideration, but I'm coming with you, and if you're trying to pull something, girl, you'll regret it. As they prepared to ride to the abandoned Whitmore farm, Sarah May caught James's eye. She saw the pain there, the helplessness of a man who'd found something precious only to have it threatened by forces beyond his control. I'll find a way, she mouthed silently, hoping he could read the determination in her eyes. But even as she made the promise, Sarah May wasn't sure she believed it herself. The past had come calling, and it seemed determined to drag her back into the darkness she'd fought so hard to escape. Chapter 5. The Price of Freedom. The ride to the abandoned Whitmore farm was a journey through Sarah May's past, each familiar landmark a reminder of the life she'd left behind. The small cabin looked even more desolate than she remembered, its windows dark and empty, weeds growing up through the porch boards. The fields that had once held her father's hopes and dreams were now nothing but cracked earth and stubborn prairie grass. Sheriff Tom Bradley dismounted with obvious reluctance, his weathered face reflecting the distaste he felt for the entire situation. He was a fair man, but he was also bound by the law, even when that law led to outcomes that troubled his conscience. James, he said quietly as they approached the cabin, I'm sorry about this. But Crane's got papers, and they look legitimate. Until a judge says otherwise, I got to enforce them. James studied the documents carefully, his jaw tightening with each line he read. Sarah May watched his face, seeing the calculation there, the way he was searching for any loophole or inconsistency that might save her from Crane's clutches. These could be forged, he said finally, but even he seemed to realize how weak the argument sounded. Could be, the sheriff agreed, but they look real enough to me, and until a judge says otherwise, I got to enforce them. Crane dismounted with a triumphant smile, clearly enjoying the power he held over the situation. His two hired men flanked him, their hands resting casually on their weapons. Don't worry, Mackenzie, he said with mock sympathy. I'll take real good care of your little investment. The implication in his words was clear, and Sarah May saw James's hand tighten on his gun. For a moment she thought he might actually draw on Crane, consequences be damned. But then his eyes met hers, and she saw the anguish there, the knowledge that violence would only make things worse. Sarah May stood on the sagging porch of her childhood home, memories flooding back with painful clarity. This was where her mother had died, where her father had slowly destroyed himself with gambling and drink, where she'd spent countless nights wondering if there was any hope for a better future. But now she was different. The months at the ranch had changed her, given her strength and confidence she'd never possessed before. She wasn't the frightened girl who'd been sold to pay her father's debts. She was a woman who'd learned to rope cattle, to read the weather, to stand up for herself and others. "The papers should be in my mother's room," she said, leading the group into the cabin. The interior was dusty and abandoned, furniture covered with sheets, the air stale with disuse. But she moved through the space with purpose, remembering exactly where her mother had kept her important documents. The wooden box was still there, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, in what had been her parents' bedroom. Sarah May's hands trembled slightly as she lifted it out, knowing that her future might depend on what was inside. "Well?" Crane demanded impatiently. "What's in there?" Sarah May opened the box slowly, her heart pounding. Inside were various documents: her parents' marriage certificate, her own birth certificate, some old letters, and, there, at the bottom, a folded piece of paper that made her breath catch. "This," she said, unfolding the document with careful hands. "This is a receipt, dated 7 months ago. It shows my father paid you $500 in full with interest. Got your signature right here at the bottom." The silence that followed was deafening. Crane's face went pale, then flushed red with anger. That's impossible. I never what?" Sarah May pressed, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Never got paid? Or never expected anyone to find the receipt?" Sheriff Bradley took the paper, examining it carefully. His expression grew increasingly grim as he compared it to the debt papers Crane had provided. The handwriting was clearly the same, and the signature was unmistakably Crane's. "This receipt predates your debt claim by a month, Crane," the sheriff said slowly, "and it's got your signature clear as day." "It's a forgery," Crane sputtered, but his voice lacked conviction. The girl's trying to tell the truth," James interrupted, stepping up beside Sarah May, "which is more than I can say for you." But Sarah May wasn't finished. The months of working alongside James had taught her to be thorough, to think several steps ahead. She reached back into the box and pulled out another document, this one even more damaging to Crane's case. "And this," she said, holding up a letter written in her father's shaky handwriting, "is a letter my father wrote to my mother's sister in San Antonio, dated 2 weeks before he died. In it, he confesses to forging Crane's signature on fake debt papers, hoping to use them to extort money from whoever bought me. The letter was actually something else entirely, a rambling apology her father had written but never sent." But in the dim light of the cabin, with everyone's attention focused on the drama unfolding, Sarah May was gambling that no one would examine it too closely. Crane's face twisted with rage. "You lying little—" "Careful," James said quietly, his hand moving to his gun. "You're talking about a lady." The sheriff folded both documents and tucked them into his vest. "I reckon this is a matter for the judge now. But until then, I don't see any legal claim here, Crane. The debt was paid and you got the receipt to prove it." "This is ridiculous," Crane exploded. "You're all in on this together. That receipt is fake and so is that letter." "Then prove it," Sarah May said calmly, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. "Take it to a judge. Have an expert examine the handwriting, but until then I'm going home." The word home hung in the air, and she realized with a start that she meant it. The ranch wasn't just where she lived, it was truly home, the first real home she'd ever known. Crane looked around at the faces surrounding him, the sheriff's growing suspicion, James's protective stance, his own men's obvious discomfort with the situation. He was a man who'd built his reputation on intimidation and legal manipulation, but he'd never faced someone who was willing to fight back with his own weapons. "This ain't over," he muttered, but the fight had gone out of him. "Yes, it is," Sarah May replied, her voice steady and sure. "It's been over since the day you decided to prey on desperate people. The only difference is now everyone knows it." As Crane and his men rode away, their departure marked by angry muttering and dark looks, Sheriff Bradley tipped his hat to Sarah May. "That was well done, miss. Took courage to stand up like that." "Thank you, Sheriff," Sarah May replied, "but I had good teachers." After the sheriff left, Sarah May found herself alone with James in the abandoned cabin. The crisis had passed, but something had changed between them during those tense moments in the yard. The pretense that their relationship was simply one of employer and employee had been stripped away, leaving something deeper and more complex in its place. "You didn't have to do that," James said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Stand up to Crane like that. I would have found another way." "I know," Sarah May replied, moving closer to him in the dim light of the cabin. "But I wanted to. For the first time in my life I had the power to fight back, and I wasn't going to waste it." James turned to face her fully, his dark eyes reflecting the last light of day filtering through the dusty windows. "Sarah May, I need to tell you something. When your father sold you to pay his debt, I didn't buy you. I bought your freedom, but somewhere along the way you stole something from me." Her heart began to race, hope and fear warring in her chest. "What did I steal?" "My heart," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm hoping maybe you might want to keep it." Sarah May felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "James Mackenzie, I've been yours since the day you taught